Nice to see you all here, and a large crowd with people from clearly a variety of ages, I can see, and different backgrounds, I'm told, as well. So, I'm going to, rather than just talk about the ethics of career choice, which is perhaps what the abstract suggested, I'm going to give you a bit more background about why I'm interested in this project, what I'm working on right at the moment. I'm writing a book of which this discussion is a part, and why that's important, and how aspects of it do relate to all of you, even if questions about career choice are a matter of past choices to reflect upon now for some of you, rather than future choices to make, as they may be for others in the room. So, the project that I'm working on looks at what I see as an emerging movement known as effective altruism. That's effective with an E, not an A. And effective altruism is essentially about trying to do the most good you can with the resources that are available to you. Those resources typically are either time or money or both, perhaps some specific abilities that you have as well, which may contribute both to what you do with the time or how much money you have available as resources. I describe this as a new movement. You might say, well, what's new about it? There's certainly philanthropy, if you like, the idea of giving to help good causes has been around for a long time. But I think there is something new going on, and it has a number of different aspects to it. One part of it is this idea of effectiveness. If you look at the general field of philanthropy, there's a huge range of different causes that charities support. Notable ones, for instance, that you would find in this society would range from things like supporting the National Gallery, or music concerts, something like that, various things in the arts, through organisations that provide social services to people who are not adequately provided for by the government, to organisations that try to aid Indigenous people or aid refugees, and then to organisations that are trying to assist the global poor, like Oxfam perhaps, and also organisations that are trying to do things that are not particularly helping human beings, but might be helping animals, or might be trying to protect the environment or endangered species, or perhaps protect future generations from the impact of climate change. It's certainly going to impact present generations as well as future generations. But what you don't find generally in the field is an attempt to sort out where you might have the most impact among these organisations, among the vast array of both different causes and specific organisations within those causes. You don't find much attempt to sort out where, if you are going to donate, let's just take that as a start, where you are going to put, where you should put your resources for them to be most effective. Now you might say, and some people do say, well, that's really an entirely subjective judgment. It depends what it is that you want to do, what it is that you want to favour. And there's no way of deciding between things like supporting the arts and supporting the global poor through an organisation that is trying to do that. I don't think that that's true. I certainly understand that people have different personal priorities, but the effective altruism movement tries to get people not just to say, well, I really love music, so I'm going to support concerts, Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, or what it might be. And also not to say, and this might be something that's personally closer to you, something like, well, my mother or my wife died of breast cancer, so I'm going to support research into breast cancer. But to say, stop and think about where you actually can do the most good. And I think you can make some judgments. I'm very sorry, but I'm finding it a little distracting, the chatter at this end of the table, because you're close to me. So I do think that there are some judgments that we can make where we can say something that is reasonably objective about the different kind of impacts you can have. One way in which you can look at this, for instance, something that I've been involved with for quite a long time, is comparing the difference that you can make by helping people in this country as compared to helping some of the global poor in some of the world's poorest countries. So we're very fortunate in Australia. I think we know that we're fortunate that we have a society in which essentially nobody starves, virtually nobody is malnourished. No doubt there are some people who are malnourished for various reasons, but you could say it's a very tiny number, and it's not because of lack of resources if they are malnourished. Everybody has access to a quite decent level of health care. Everybody has access to safe drinking water and to education for their children. So if we compare that with other countries, of course, we know that that's not the case. There's over 1 billion people in the world who fall below the World Bank's line of what it calls extreme poverty. Extreme poverty it defines as having less than $1.25 US per day to live on, and that is purchasing power parity. It's not the currency exchange. So if you've travelled in poorer countries and you think, oh, it's amazing how far a dollar goes in those countries, that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about having the amount of money that can buy in the country where the person lives the same as you can buy for $1.25 in the US. So it's an extremely minimal amount, and obviously a significant number of these people or their children are hungry or are malnourished, don't have health care, can't send their children to school in some cases, and therefore are vastly worse off than we are. And I think it's demonstrable that even though there are some transfer costs in making sure that your money is going to do what it's supposed to do, that your money goes a lot further in those countries. It provides things for people which they could not get otherwise. And you can see this if you just look at some of the advertising around. I imagine a lot of you, for example, have seen the Fred Hollows Foundation advertisement, Restore Sight for $25. Now, whether that figure is accurate, totally accurate or not, I'm not going to vouch for. But certainly there are people in developing countries who are blind, whose sight can be restored by a quite simple piece of surgery, but they're not getting that surgery. And so they have the problem of being blind and poor in a developing country. There really is nobody in Australia in that situation. Everybody who is blind by something that is easily correctable by surgery is going to have that, is going to be able to have that surgery done. So these are examples that kind of things that if you're interested in your altruism being effective and making the biggest possible difference, then it should lead you to consider organisations that are helping the global poor rather than helping people who, although poor by Australian standards, are poor in a relative sense. They're poor in comparison to the majority of the population here, and that's certainly unfortunate, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't bother doing anything about that. I do think that the government ought to be doing what it can to help those people, but if as an individual, one is making a choice that one can make about donating here or donating overseas, I think that it's clear that you do more good through finding an effective organisation that is donating overseas. And there are effective organisations. A second aspect of this movement is that there is a lot more going on now in the way of assessing the effectiveness of both individual programs and of aid organisations. And you can find that online and look at organisations that are making a difference and that have been assessed and scrutinised. There's a website called givewell.org if you want to look at that. It's an American website, not currently listing Australian organisations, but it's a good way of looking at the way in which you can evaluate organisations to choose. And I think it's taken that discussion to a much deeper level than it was before. A few years ago, people often said, well, how much of the money will go to the program and how much of it will go to the administration and fundraising of the organisation? And that was basically the only question people were asking. Well, it's a relevant question. I'm not saying it's not a relevant question, but it actually doesn't tell you a great deal, because you could have two organisations, one of which, let's say, spends a third of the money it receives on administration, and another which spends only 10% of the money that it receives on administration. And you might think, oh, it's clearly better to give to the one that spends only 10% on administration. But maybe the reason it spends only 10% on administration is it doesn't pay for staff out in the field to monitor and evaluate the programs that it's funding. So it can say, oh yes, 90% of what you give us will go to the programs. But they don't really know whether the programs are doing what they're intended to do. And perhaps, let's say, half of them will not. So in that case, of the remaining 90%, actually only 45% is doing any good. Where the organisation that spends a third on administration maybe is able to monitor its program, weed out the ones that are not doing any good, and so perhaps all of its ongoing programs are doing good, or maybe 90% of them are doing good. So you do the math, you'll see that you actually, more of your money is doing good if you give to the organisation that has higher administrative costs in that example. So that's another important thing that we have to think about, to try to make our altruism, our philanthropy effective. It's important that we look at what the organisation is actually doing, and that we encourage the organisations to do independent monitoring, independent evaluation of what's going on. Because as the donors, we can be an influential force on them, and in that way we can get them to see that it's important to really find out that their programs are doing good. That it's not for us just a kind of feel-good thing about saying, well, I've given to them. It's not really for us. A lot of philanthropy, I think, in a sense, starts from the idea that I'll feel better if I donate to this organisation or that organisation. And that's one reason that a lot of people actually give to quite a lot of organisations, give small donations to a lot of organisations. Which again, when you think about it, is probably not the most effective thing to do, because there's a processing cost for every donation. So I think one survey in the United States showed that, I can't remember the exact figure, but something like a third of donations received by charities were $10 or less. Well, you think about that, it's probably going to cost the organisation $10 in staff time to process the organisation, give them your standard thank you letter and receipt and so on. So if you want to be effective, you really should think about what's the best organisation, or maybe if you can't decide that, the best 2 or 3 organisations, and divide your donations among them. Because the point is not to make you feel good that, oh yes, I supported all these different good causes. The point is to actually make a significant difference in what you're doing. Now, that relates to something in the background of this movement, which, as I say, I think is an emerging movement. There's different organisations that you can find now online that are encouraging people to evaluate organisations and encouraging people also to give more substantially to effective organisations. One of them is one that I've set up. It's got the name of the last book of mine that I wrote in this area. The book was called The Life You Can Save, and the organisation is thelifeyoucansave.org. You can find that online. Another one is called Giving What We Can, set up coincidentally by another Australian who is at Oxford, I have to say, Kerry, not at Cambridge. Went there to do a PhD and is now a research fellow at Oxford. And he's also, his name is Toby Ord. He's also been active in this field. And there is a lot of general buzz going on in the web. If you put in effective altruism, you find a Wikipedia page, which was just set up a year or two ago. You find a lot of other chat and discussion board going on about that topic. Okay, let me come to the question about career choice, and maybe I'll introduce this aspect of the topic by talking about a student I had at Princeton only about 3 or 4 years back, a young man called Matt Wager. So Matt took my course in practical ethics, which is a pretty large undergraduate course that covers a range of different ethical issues, including questions about the obligations of the rich to the global poor, or what the rich should be doing. And Matt came to see me at one point. I don't get to know, the class is too big for me to get to know everybody in the class individually, but he came to see me to talk about some of the things talked about in the course, including questions about what he might do in his life after he graduated. Now, Matt was a philosophy major, and an extremely good one. In fact, in his final year, he received the philosophy department's prize for the best senior thesis. All Princeton undergraduates in their final year write a thesis of about 20,000 words in the department in which they're majoring. So to get the prize from the philosophy department for the best thesis is a mark of distinction, and on that basis, and the basis of his other results, Matt received various offers to go to graduate school to study, to do philosophy, and maybe was thinking about that and the possibility of going on with a career as an academic. But after talking to a few people, and so he did talk to me, but I can't say trying to have been particularly influential in the final decision he made the decision instead to go into the finance industry, effectively to go to Wall Street. He was extremely bright. He also had, as well as doing philosophy, he previously had a math background, and as you know, people with math qualifications are particularly in demand in Wall Street for the quants, the quantitative types. Now you might say, well, why did he do this? Was he turning his back on the kinds of things that I've been talking about in my course? The answer is no, not at all. He went to Wall Street because that was the way that he could earn the most money. And he didn't want the most money because he wanted to live a luxurious lifestyle and drive great sports cars and live in a large apartment in a trendy part of Manhattan. He wanted to earn the most money so that he could give more money away. And he has been very successful in doing that. He gave away, last year, I'm in touch with him, he gave away a 6-figure sum last year. This is 2 or 3 years, I think only 2 years out from graduation. So essentially, the career choice that he made was not, well, it was made on an ethical basis, but was not what you might imagine would be a typically ethical career choice. Which you might have imagined would be to go and work for an Oxfam, or become a doctor and work for Doctors Without Borders, or something along those lines. His idea was that he could maximise the good that he could do by maximising his earnings and the amount that he could give. Now, would that in fact be the best choice for somebody with his skills and his background? I think there's a good case for saying that it was the best choice that he could make. Consider let's say he had the option. I mean, obviously he had the option of being an academic. That was one possibility. But in addition to that, he, perhaps because of the skills he had, he would have also had the option of going to work for an Oxfam or some other NGO along those lines. And he had the possibility of the choice that he did make. You might think that being an academic is the worst of these choices, that you don't earn a huge amount of money, especially now in the job market. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether you're going to get a permanent job at all, and you probably don't have a huge amount of influence. So I do think you shouldn't neglect the influence that you can have on the students who will be going through year after year. But you might have thought a more ethical choice would be go and work for an NGO, and with the skills you've got to try and improve the performance of that NGO. But Matt and a few others who work in this area looked at it this way. If I apply for a job with, let's just say, Oxfam as the example, doesn't matter which organisation, if I apply for a job with Oxfam, let's assume that I get that job. There are plenty of other people who would like that job, and if I hadn't applied, the next person, if you assume that Oxfam made a ranking of the applicants, the next highest applicant would have got the job. The difference between what I can do for Oxfam and what that next best applicant can do is probably pretty marginal. It's unlikely that there's going to be a big difference in what I could do and what the next person could do. So essentially, if I don't take the job at Oxfam, I'll be replaced by someone else doing very similar work at a very similar level. Now, consider what happens if I go to Wall Street. It's true in one sense that the same thing happens. If the trading firm, let's say, that I'm going to doesn't hire me, it'll hire someone else who can do the job probably just as well or virtually as well. But that's not what we're interested in. If what we're interested in is having the best impact, doing the most good. What we're interested in is what will come as a result of that person getting the job. So I know that if I get the job, I'm going to be able to give a lot of money to Oxfam or other worthy organisations. If I don't get the job, the next person in line who does get the job is very unlikely to do that. Because, sad to say, it's not a common practice in Wall Street for people to give half of what they're earning or even more to good causes. They are much more likely to spend it on a luxurious lifestyle for themselves. So essentially, Matt was saying, I'd be replaceable if I worked for the charity in a way that I would not be replaceable if I go to Wall Street. And with the money that I earn, I can actually fund not just one, but probably 2 or in future maybe 5 or 10 positions at an effective charity. Because even half of the salary, let's say Matt's giving half of his salary away, even half of the salary that a successful Wall Street trader gets is more than twice as much as an employee at Oxfam is likely to get, certainly starting salary. So not only will I be replaced for the job that I didn't get, but there'll be new positions that the charity will be able to create, or there'll be other things that will be able to set up new programs because of the money that I am able to donate to it. So I think this is, for the right person, this is quite a strong consideration. And it ought to make us think differently about going into areas that many people think of as somehow there's something wrong with going into banking or finance or other areas where you're likely to earn a substantial amount of money. I think the answer to that, the response to that is, it all depends on what you're going to do with it. Admittedly, there are some things that you might want to think about here. Matt says that he had to think about, was he going to be able to maintain his resolve to give large amounts while living in the milieu of other Wall Street types. And he wasn't totally sure about that, but one thing that he did was to be very public about what he was doing. He not only told his friends about it, he posted it on social media that he was going to go to Wall Street, and he was pledging to give away half of what he earned as a minimum. So he was going to look bad if suddenly he turned out to be living extravagantly and not giving anything to charities. It was a way of keeping himself up to the mark. Who knows whether that's going to last 5 years or 10 years or 30 or 40 years if he stays in that area. But at the moment he's doing fine, and even if he only does it for a relatively small number of years, given the earning capacity he has, there'll be a substantial good that he can do. Another thing that is sometimes said about this kind of choice is you're complicit in doing bad things when you do this. Now, obviously, this is going to depend on your view of the finance sector and whether you think that generally it's a positive, that it helps provide a free market economy which increases productivity, provides services that people need, or whether you think that it's a giant conspiracy against the poor to line the pockets of the richest 1% and cause all sorts of environmental damage and whatever. Those are both possible views, and that's not my aim here today to try to sort them out. But again, I think the question of replaceability is relevant. I think the fact that if Matt were not doing the job that he's doing, then somebody else would be doing it, is relevant here. In other words, if you do think that there's harm in what the finance sector does generally, it probably would have been done anyway, and indeed the person doing it would almost certainly have been a less ethical person than Matt, would have thought less about this, and so if there's an opportunity for an employee, not the CEO, but just an employee, to have any influence in whether the financial institution does or does not support practices that harm the global poor or damage the environment, then I think we can be pretty confident that Matt is more likely to do that than the person who would have replaced him. So I don't think that that's really a good objection either. What I think is true is that it's not a career for everyone. It depends on your having both certain abilities and a certain character. The abilities are obvious. Not everybody is going to get offered a job straight out of an undergraduate degree that carries a six-figure salary and that enables you to give away such large amounts. So you have to have the ability to get that kind of job for a start. But you also, I think, need to have the kind of character that can work well in that environment. If you hate what you're doing, you're probably not going to be very successful at it. Matt doesn't hate what he's doing. There is a fair amount of intellectual challenge, the use of his mathematical abilities in what he's doing, and he actually gets on quite well with his colleagues, even though they may not have the same ultimate goals that he does. So he's somebody who does seem to be suited for it, but as I say, clearly not everyone would be. But there are other people who are now doing this, and that's part of what I meant when I said that effective altruism is an emerging movement. There's an organisation that's counselling people on career choice with this as one of the options it considers. It's called 80,000 hours, and you can look it up on the web as well, just the numbers, 80,000hours.org. And it has that name because the founder, Will McCaskill, calculated that that's the number of hours that the average person spends over their lifetime on their career. So it's trying to make the point that it's a very important choice what you're going to do if you're going to spend 80,000 hours of your life doing it. And as I say, going into this kind of what they call earning to give is one of the options, and there are a number of other people that I'm in contact with who are doing it in various ways. So I'm going to stop at that point because I imagine that you will have a number of questions, and I'm told that these events generally finish around 2 o'clock. So I want to give you, we've got about 15 minutes for some questions, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, and if there's anything you want me to elaborate, other aspects of it, I'll certainly be happy to do so. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for that talk. It's really great. I'm just, interested to. I also agree that we do have sort of an obligation to give aid to those overseas, but I know that there are many arguments that say we have duty to those that are socially or psychologically more close to us, and that's often a reason that people give for not giving to people overseas. So what's sort of your view on that, and do you think that should be more of an obligation for our money or our time.
Right. Kerry asked me to repeat the question into the microphone. I'm just recording, so I'll say. So essentially the question is, do we have obligations to give to those who are close to us in one or other ways that are prior to obligations to give to people who are, people I've been talking about, who are far from us and strangers to us, but in greater need? I think that we do have an obligation to give to people who are in the greatest need, which is not to say that we shouldn't take any notice of the needs of people who are close to us. Obviously, the family is one unit that's very close, and I think pretty much everybody would say that if a member of my family is in need of some sort, I'm going to help them first, rather than strangers. And then, the questions about your local community, where I guess what you can see is sort of various circles of greater or lesser obligation. But I think that while we certainly ought to be thinking of those close to us, it's dependent on what it is that we're actually doing for them and how much difference we can make. So clearly, within your family, if you have children, let's say, or you have parents who need assistance, yes, you would do something for them, but you wouldn't necessarily think that all of your resources, time and resources, needs to go to them. I mean, there may be rare cases where really it has to, but in general, fortunately, we can see that our children are well nourished, get good health care, go to school, get a good education, and all of those things, without having really to spend very much on that. And I don't think that we have an obligation to make sure that they have the very best of every toy or gadget or computer game or whatever else it might be that's going around, before we start the obligations that we have to people who are strangers to us start to cut in. So I think there are differences, but I would say that if we're talking, let's say we just compare people in Australia who are not part of our close friends or family with people overseas, generally I think that the needs of people who are living in extreme poverty would take priority over other fellow Australians who are strangers to us, because of the difference in the impact that we can make, because of the differences in need, and because our dollars go so much further with people who are essentially struggling on $1 or $2 per day. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your talk. I'm finding it hard to I'm finding it hard to fathom what you're trying to get at here, because what I don't understand is if someone has the opportunity to earn more money as opposed to working in an area that will be more socially helpful. For example, say if your student Matt was offered a job where a fashion company wanted him to be the CEO of this fashion company, manufactures their clothes in India in these terrible conditions with poor workers, that he would justify his position by saying, well, he'll work for that organisation, but he'll give away half of his money to help the poor in India. I mean, it sort of doesn't really match up for me with that kind of, to not have an ethical choice in the career in the first place. I mean, for example, Wall Street, I mean, it's sort of, I find Wall Street and all that, this is the problem, essentially, to why there is poverty. So what I can't understand is how you're helping by supporting a system which is the problem in the first place.
Okay, thanks for the question. So you're asking whether it can be ethical to help the poor with a donation of earnings that come from something that you think is unethical in the first place? And that's a really good question, because I think it does get to some of the point of what the questions that effective altruism and the people doing it are asking. Essentially, they're asking, where can I make the most difference? Now, let's take the point that you ended with, that you think that Wall Street and the capitalist system is responsible for global poverty. Again, that's a highly controversial claim. There may be an element of truth in it. I certainly think it's not the whole truth, but there may be an element of truth in it. I don't know, for sure.
Take the example of, say, working for a fashion company that manufactures clothes.
Okay, so your example, was perhaps he could earn more money by working for a fashion company that is hiring workers in India, and they're in appalling conditions. Let's say they're in unsafe conditions, like the factory in Bangladesh that collapsed recently. Well, again, still the question that would be asked is, where can I make the most difference? Now, if let's say that the choices are that he works for this company or somebody else works for the company. If he doesn't take the job, somebody else is going to work for that company, and they're probably going to be less sensitive to the plight of the workers, and they're going to put less pressure on the company than he might be able to put to say, look, you know, even if you're just trying to maximise profits to shareholders, it's going to look really bad for our image if one of these factories collapses and workers are killed. So let's give them better working conditions, right? You could imagine Matt putting that argument, if he were in that situation, because he knows that that's the only way that you'll actually get the company to make a difference. Whereas somebody else might just say, oh look, we're making good profits here, let's hope nothing happens. So in terms of making a difference to the workers, it's not clear that him refusing to take that job would have helped the workers. On the other hand, it is clear that by taking that job and earning a lot of money, he will be able to help a number of poor people who would not otherwise have been helped. So essentially, by giving you that answer, what I'm saying is that I'm not really, and I think this is reasonably typical of the effective altruism movement, though I shouldn't really try and speak for everybody in it, some might take a different view. But generally people are saying, look, I'm not really concerned with whether I have, you know, some kind of complicity in this, with whether I have clean hands or not. I'm concerned with the consequences of my choices. And if the consequences of my choices will, on the whole, be better for people generally or for the global poor, then that's what I'll do. Even if it's true that this makes me a part of an organisation that is doing bad things, but the organisation wouldn't stop doing those bad things even if I said, I'm having nothing to do with this. Okay? So there are two different kinds of moral attitudes here, and roughly you could characterise them as a consequentialist or utilitarian attitude, which I think is what effective altruism is broadly in the family of, not committed to, which says, look at the consequence of what you do, and what philosophers call a deontological view, or a view based, if you like, on sort of moral rules, that says, look, there's a moral rule that you should not take part in any organisation that is harming people in some way, and therefore even if your resignation doesn't make any difference, you ought to resign from it. Even if your resignation actually makes it worse because the person who will replace you will be even harsher, still you have to separate yourself from that organisation. That's not the attitude generally that effective altruists will take. Now, of course you may disagree with that view. Some people do. But I think that there is a reasonable case for it that's at least worth discussing.
Should social responsibility be an obligation for businesses, or should sort of the independence of the typical private business model prevail? And if it is not to be an obligation, how can we encourage businesses, which arguably have significant potential to be effective altruists due to their large capital, to be more socially responsible?
So the question is whether social responsibility is an obligation for businesses or not, and if it's not, how can we encourage them to be more responsible? Firstly, I do think that social responsibility is an obligation for businesses. I mean, it's really a different question from the question that I was just asked, because that question was about individual choices whether to go and do business or not. But I certainly think that a corporation that treats its workers in the way that the business in Bangladesh did, which was actually a Bangladeshi business, although it was supplying brands that were selling in our markets and many others, I think that they are clearly doing something wrong. That they have, every corporation has a responsibility to its workers, the safety of its workers, and to its customers as well, and to its suppliers, and to the community in which it operates. And a good business, I think, an ethically good business would do that, and the people running that business would want to make sure that it did do that. You also asked a slightly different question: how can we make businesses socially responsible? I think the answer to that is by being ethical consumers, by not buying products from businesses that are not responsible. And so after the collapse of the Bangladesh textile factory, a number of brands said that they were going to set codes for their suppliers and ensure that they adhered to them. And a couple didn't. So, if you're educated and you know which do and which don't, you'll buy from the ones that do, and you'll maybe write to the ones that don't and say, I'm not buying your products anymore because of this. So I think that kind of consumer pressure can make a difference, and does make a difference in, there are many examples where it has made a difference.
Yeah. Our first responsibility to the poor Indigenous people here or poor people overseas?
Is our first responsibility to poor Indigenous people in this country or poor overseas? Again, if we're speaking as individuals, rather than saying what the government ought to be doing, I think we ought to look at where our dollars make the biggest difference. The problems of poor Indigenous people are difficult in various ways, and it's not easy to make a big impact on them, even with quite significant amounts of money. I think we've seen that from the relative failure, not complete failure, but relative failure of various government programs over the years to help Indigenous people overcome some of the problems that undoubtedly Europeans generations ago created for them. But the fact that these problems are so resistant to some of the changes and some of the quite expensive programs that have been directed to changing them suggests to me that if I am able to give a specific but obviously finite sum of money to help people, it's going to make a bigger impact in some of the overseas countries where people do not already have access to the levels of social services and healthcare and education and so on that are provided for Indigenous people in this country. So it's a question of the marginal difference that your resources make to me.
Let's take two more questions, sir.
To what degree is effective altruism having an influence on government? Because, when you look at overseas aid budgets, if you're going to look at a pure poverty alleviation or where the dollar goes furthest, you end up putting 95% of your budget into sort of poverty alleviation in rural India and nothing for anyone else. Is that something that you'd advocate? To what degree would you advocate that? And to what degree are these kind of ideas being taken up by those in government with the biggest amount of money to spend?
So the question is, to what extent the ideas of effective altruism are being taken up by government, and specifically with examples to the government foreign aid programs. I think they're starting to have some influence. I think it's not great, and it varies from country to country. But I think the idea of doing more evaluation and monitoring is something that is catching on. It certainly had more influence in Australia. If you talk to the people involved in the Australian aid programs, Australian government aid programs, you find more. If you go to Britain, I've talked to people involved with DFID, the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Development. Sorry, anyway, something like that, yes. May have got the things slightly wrong. So they're also looking much more closely at this and focusing more on helping the global poor. Does it mean that you put more into rural India? Well, it may, although some people would say that we don't want to prevent the Indian government from putting more into rural India, because India is getting to be a larger economy now. There's a quite substantial affluent middle class in India now, which there wasn't 20 or 30 years ago, and obviously you want to encourage them to take on more responsibility. So you might in fact put more into countries where there isn't the resources within the country to help, to avoid a kind of disincentive effect with a country like India. But certainly what you would do is focus on where you can make the biggest difference to global poor, and you wouldn't do things like look at those countries where you've got the greatest foreign policy significance. So if you look at US aid, until quite recently, the largest recipient of US aid was Iraq. Not because it's one of the poorest countries, it's not at all, has quite a lot of oil wealth, but obviously because it was part of the war against terrorism and the United States was heavily involved. That's now switched to Afghanistan for somewhat similar reasons. Afghanistan is a much poorer country than Iraq, so there's some justification for doing that. But yeah, relatively, only a small part of US aid goes to the very poorest countries in the world. And again, there's an attempt to try to change that, but it's a very, it's like trying to turn around a huge ship which has a lot of inertia, and it's going to take time to achieve that.
One more question? Anne?
As a practicing Christian, I believe that a willingness to share, and as a grandparent and grandparent, how would you go about inculcating this attitude of gratitude in young people? Because I think if it doesn't start there, you're probably fighting an uphill battle.
Okay, so this question is about how we go to inculcate this attitude in children and grandchildren. So I agree that in the long run, obviously, we want this attitude to spread. And I think one way of doing this is, I think children have a kind of innate generosity often when they see other people in need, but it may be relatively short-lived, it may be somewhat spontaneous, it may get overwhelmed by various other pressures that children are under, and of course growing up in a consumer society that puts a lot of stress on the goodies you have. It's something that is there, I think, but it needs to be nurtured and encouraged. And I can remember with my own children, when questions about people in need came up, they would want to put aside some of their allowance, their pocket money, to help, and I think that was a good thing to encourage. And I think as soon as they were old enough to understand that we, my wife and I, were giving to organisations like Oxfam, we tried to get them involved in that bit. We used to take them to Oxfam used to have this Walk on Want event, and I don't think it does anymore, unfortunately, but we would take them to for those events and a lot of others. So we try and make them part of the community and get them to see that giving should be a normal part of your life. It shouldn't just be something that you think about once a year before you do your tax return or something. It should be something that is a part of our life all the way through, and that there's nothing extraordinary about sharing some of your good fortune with people who have so much less.